Greetings everyone. Welcome to the ongoing series on making of contemporary India. In today's lecture, the topic of the discussion would be laying the foundation of economy of independent India. In this, I am going to discuss about the several causes of underdevelopment of Indian economy that one must know about at the time of independence. Then also the aim would be to highlight the consequences of British rule on Indian economy and how a new economic order was envisioned by the leaders at the time of independence. So, in this, the focus of discussion would be related to agriculture, industry, then the planning period, the 5-year plans, annual plans, and also a discussion related to developments that took place in the field of education, science, technology, etc. So, if we talk about the economy of India, then India has a long economic history ranging from Vedic period to medieval times, and even before Vedic period one can talk about the proto-historic period, that is Indus Valley civilization, and how all these developments from ancient to medieval to modern period led into different aspects that were developing from time to time and different economic characteristics that were emerging during respective periods. So, India began its development path in 1950 after getting independent from colonial rule in 1947. By being under the colonial rule for approximately 200 years, it had engendered specific characteristics within its economic structure. The structure of India's present day economy is not just of current making or something that happened from 1947 onwards. It has its roots steeped in the history, especially the history from 1757 onwards, when English East India Company began its control from Battle of Plassey onwards. It is important for us to know country's economic conditions at the time of independence to understand the present economic scenario. One term that can be used to describe Indian economy in the post 1947 scenario was that of underdeveloped economy. As an underdeveloped economy, Indian economy was characterized by low per capita income, and by 1947-48 per capita income was as low as rupees 230. People were poor and were not getting fair square meals a day. They had no shelter and clothing. There was large scale unemployment among working population. The economy was also having poor infrastructure. Infrastructural development, which comprised of communication, transportation, electricity, was very dismal. In 1948, power generation capacity was nearly 2100 megawatts and the length of railway lines was somewhere around 53,000 kilometers, and the country was heavily dependent on imports for even goods that are important for survival. Several consumer goods like sewing machines, medicines, bicycles, oil, etc. were being imported from abroad. There was widespread poverty, illiteracy was rampant, and this was further leading to more and more poverty. Due to illiteracy, people were unable to use new techniques in agriculture and industry. And then there was also a challenge of partition, which again was a huge drain, not only emotionally and mentally, but also a drain on Indian resources. So, if we talk about the different sectors of Indian economy on the eve of independence, the most important sector at that time, that is the agricultural sector, was marked by a very low level of productivity. Agricultural productivity became quite low and stagnant, and this was largely due to the systems of land settlement that had been introduced by the British government. I have already discussed in detail what were the repercussions of the new land revenue settlements that had been introduced by the colonial regime over different parts of India. So, in this background, one can briefly mention the zamindari system or the permanent settlement, in which the profit accruing out of agricultural sector went to zamindars instead of the cultivators, or in other revenue settlements like Mahalwadi and Rayatwadi, the clear beneficiaries were the Britishers. Then another very important feature of Indian agriculture had been high dependence on monsoon. No effort had been made during the British rule to develop permanent means of irrigation or to rationalize the use of natural resources. So, because of lack of proper input and very low level of technology, then also lack of irrigation facilities and negligible use of fertilizers, the plight of the farmers had been increasing, and all these factors contributed to the dismal level of agricultural productivity. Another very important feature of Indian agriculture had been small and fragmented land holdings. The land revenue system under the British Raj clearly indicated that the zamindars were recognized as the permanent owners of the soil. The zamindars were to pay a fixed sum to the government as land revenue, and they were free to extract as much from the tillers of the soil. Then another very important factor that promoted backwardness and stagnation in Indian agriculture was forced commercialization of agriculture. The farmers were forced to shift from food crops to commercial crops like indigo, and the conventional food crops like rice and wheat were to be replaced by these commercial crops, as indigo was required by the textile industry in Britain for dyeing the textile, but growing indigo robbed the land of its essential nutrients. There was predominance of agriculture in the economy in terms of both income as well as employment. Britishers had used India as a source of raw material on the one hand, and as a market for ready-made products of their industries on the other hand, and this trend started all the more as a result of the industrial revolution that had taken place in England. This resulted in very little focus being given to Indian industries, and large industries that were used to produce consumer goods were never a priority for Britishers in India. Therefore, at the time of independence, there were very few basic or key industries to talk of. In 1947, cement production was merely 26 lakh tons, and of sugar it was 10 lakh tons, and cloth was only 421 crore meters. So, economy was characterized by lack of capital required for economic growth. Another very important feature of colonial economy had been discriminatory tariff policy. The British government allowed tariff-free export of raw materials from India, again in order to boost their own industries, their economy. and the tariff-free import of British industrial products was being filled in India in order to make their produce far more cheaper than the ones that were available in India. A heavy duty on the export of Indian handicraft products further fulfilled their desire of deindustrializing Indian economy. This resulted in decay of handicrafts industry in India. Having discussed the important features or the problems that plagued Indian agriculture, we can now also talk about the situation of industrial sector on the eve of independence. One very important factor that I have just mentioned was that of competition from machine. Industrial revolution in Britain gave a stiff competition to the handicraft industries in India because of low cost and better quality product that was being produced by the machines in Britain. And this forced Indian craftsmen to shut down the handicraft industry in India, which further was also being done because Indian producers were no longer to face the onslaught of discriminatory trade practices. So, new patterns of demand also were emerging. Due to British rule in India, a new class of people were emerging in India who were changing the pattern of demand in India against the Indian products and in favor of British products. As a result, Indian industry tended to decline and perish gradually. Now, there was more market that was being created for British goods, and introduction of railways further facilitated the transportation of the British products to different parts of the country. As a result, the size of the market for the low cost British products expanded while it started shrinking for the high cost Indian products. This further led to decay of industry in India. Another problem had been that foreign trade had been under the colonial rule. Net exporter of primary products and importer of finished goods. This is what India had become. Due to discriminative tariff policy that had been adopted by the colonial government in India, India gradually became an exporter of raw materials and primary products, again in order to feed British factories. On the other hand, it became a net importer of finished goods that had been reproduced by the British industries. Monopoly control of India's foreign trade was another very important factor, and the composition of exports and imports showed the backwardness of Indian economy. Exports and imports were largely restricted to Britain only due to monopoly control of India's foreign trade. So therefore, while surplus trade was being shown, but it was only to benefit Britishers. Surplus profit made an account of foreign trade during the British rule was distributed on administrative and war expenses, for which India was not getting any adequate return. And all these developments had been explained logically by the economic nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji as part of his drain theory. So, the economy was being, Indian economy was being robbed in order to fulfill the pursuits of the British government. If we talk about the demographic condition during the British rule, then it was marked by a high birth rate, but a very high death rate also. So, both birth rate and death rate were nearly 48 and 40% respectively, which suggests massive poverty and underdevelopment also in country. Then another very important marker was IMR, or infant mortality rate, which was again very high. It was around 218 per thousand, contrasting with 42 per thousand in the present scenario. And the life expectancy was as low as 32 years, which clearly indicates lack of healthcare facilities, lack of awareness, and also illiteracy. And literacy rate was as low as 16%, which again reflects the social and economic backwardness of the country. If we talk about the occupational structure on eve of independence, one term that can explain is unbalanced. Agriculture was the principal source of occupation, and more than 70% of working population was engaged in agriculture, and it was only 10% of the working population which was engaged in manufacturing sector, and only 17% of working population was engaged in the service sector, which again showed very slow growth of tertiary sector on the eve of independence. So, a major development that had happened during colonial rule was the introduction of railways, which was followed by the development of some ports and construction of some roads in order to link the core with the hinterland. But the main motive of the British government was not to modernize India or to improve communication and transportation. It was rather to foster the interest of the British government rather than to accelerate the growth of Indian economy. So, as a result of introduction of railways and other related developments, there was a transition from barter system of exchange to monetary system of exchange, which further facilitated division of labor and large scale production, but again in order to benefit the colonial economy. Now, Indian independence was a turning point in its economic history. The country was hopelessly poor as a result of the policies that had been followed by Britain. Less than a sixth of Indians were literate, and poverty and sharp social differences had really posed problems for the nation. And India's share of world income had shrunk while it was 22.6% in 1700. It had shrunk to 3.8% in 1952. So, that explains the dismal state of Indian economy and how from 22.6% in 1700 it had declined to 3.8% in 1952. So, there was a lot of challenge that the Indian nation faced. As former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had put it, the brightest jewel in the British crown was the poorest country in the world in terms of per capita income by the beginning of 20th century. Now, this sums up the way colonization had impacted India. So, when we talk about the change that happened from 1947 onwards, then the most important change that appears was the state's primacy over individual enterprise. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's development model envisaged a dominant role of the state as an all-pervasive entrepreneur and financier of private businesses. The Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 therefore proposed a mixed economy. Earlier, the Bombay Plan that had been proposed by 8 influential industrialists including J.R.D. Tata and G.D. Birla envisaged a substantial public sector with state interventions and regulations in order to protect indigenous industries. The political leadership believed that since planning was not possible in a market economy, the state and public sector would inevitably play a leading role in economic progress. So therefore, planning, commissioning and executing the program became the core strategies. India set up the Planning Commission in 1950 to oversee the entire range of planning, including resource allocation, implementation and appraisal of 5-year plans. The 5-year plans were centralized economic and social growth programs that had been modeled after those that were prevalent in the USSR. So, India's first 5-year plan that was launched in 1951 focused on agriculture and irrigation to boost farm output as India was losing precious foreign reserves on food grain imports. So, clearly the aim was to feed the teeming millions. It was based on the Harrod-Domar model that sought to boost economic growth through higher savings and investments. The plan was a success, with the economy growing at an annualized 3.6%, beating the target of 2.1%. Then another idea that was emerging was that of the free market. A student of the economist F.A. Hayek, B.R. Shenoy was an influential early advocate of free market liberalism. In a dissent note, he had warned that the second 5-year plan's dependence on deficit financing to promote heavy industrialization could bring about trouble. So, government control over the economy would undermine a young democracy. This was his opinion. So, Shenoy was proved right when India faced an external payments crisis. He was also very critical of Nehru government's insistence on import substitution. Though ignored in his lifetime, his ideas were later on found to be useful, and they became part of India's mainstream economic doctrine. Then also one must talk about an individual who gave India modern statistics and also instilled a Swadeshi spirit in economic enterprise. So, the second 5-year plan from 1956 to 61 laid the foundation for economic modernization to better serve India's long-term growth requirements. Launched in 1956, it was based on the Mahalanobis model that advocated rapid industrialization with a focus on heavy industries and capital goods. Mahalanobis was perhaps the single most important individual in giving a direction to development planning. He was the chief advisor to the commission from 1955 onwards, and he also founded the Indian Statistical Institute and is considered as the father of modern statistics in India. His plan was an invocation of the spirit of Swadeshi or self-reliance, and also a realization that it was not only agriculture that needed all the attention, but also industrial infrastructure. Now, this period, the second 5-year plan and the industrial policy resolution of 1956 that had been long been considered as the economic constitution of India, paved the way for the development of the public sector, but it also ushered in the license Raj. The resolution set out as national objective the establishment of a socialist pattern of society. It also categorized industries into three groups, that is basic and strategic importance were to be exclusively in the public sector. The second group consisted of industries that were to be state owned, and the third, mostly consumer industries, were left for the private sector. However, the private sector was kept on a tight leash through a system of licenses. So, therefore, we say that there was a shift from the British Raj to license Raj during this period. Thank you.